Picture this, a country of 40 million people, no massive military, no global reserve currency, no obvious leverage on paper. And yet, when the President of the United States came calling with a list of demands, that country looked south, crossed its arms, and said no. Not let's talk, not we'll consider it. No, that country is Canada. And the medal at the center of the standoff, the one Donald Trump didn't even bother mentioning when his own ambassador listed off what America needs from its northern neighbor, is aluminum. Quiet, unglamorous, everywhere and nowhere aluminum. The metal in your pop can, your car door, your airplane wing, and now, increasingly, the metal holding up the racks inside America's booming AI data centers. This is the story of how Canada became the country Trump can threaten, but can't actually replace. Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why the U.S. aluminum supply chain is more fragile than most Americans realize, and why Canada is holding a card nobody expected. Before we start the video, subscribe to Capital Current channel. Let's rewind for a second, because this didn't come out of nowhere. Since returning to office, Trump has leaned on tariffs as his go-to instrument of pressure against Canada's steel, aluminum, autos, you name it. Section 232 tariffs on aluminum, originally a national security measure from his first term, came roaring back, and this time they didn't stay at a modest single-digit rate. They climbed all the way up to 50% on primary aluminum, with a 25% rate applied to many downstream aluminum products. That's not a tap on the shoulder. That's a sledgehammer aimed squarely at one of Canada's most important export industries. And it didn't stop there. Trump has floated an additional 50% levy on a wide swath of other Canadian goods, tying it to grievances that range from provincial alcohol restrictions to dairy import quotas to the ongoing dispute over auto tariffs. He's set deadlines. He's pulled back from talks entirely at one point, reportedly walking away from negotiations after an Ontario government ad about tariffs rubbed him the wrong way. He suggested more than once that Canada would be better off as the 51st state, a comment that, according to Canadian officials and reporting from across the country, has done more to unify Canadians against him than almost anything else could have. Prime Minister Mark Carney, for his part, hasn't minced words about how these negotiations are actually going. He's described the talks with Washington as, in his own characterization, having turned nasty. That's not diplomatic speak. That's a head of government signaling to his own country that this isn't a friendly disagreement between allies anymore. This is a fight. Here's where it gets interesting, and where most of the coverage south of the border misses the real story. When people talk about U.S. Canada trade tension, they usually default to oil or lumber or dairy. But aluminum is quietly one of the most consequential fronts in this entire dispute, for a very simple reason. Canada doesn't just export aluminum to the United States. Canada dominates the North American aluminum supply in a way that almost no other resource relationship comes close to. Last year alone, Canada produced roughly 5 times as much primary aluminum as the United States did. 5 times. Let that sink in. This isn't a case where the U.S. has options and Canada is just one supplier among several. Canadian smelters, concentrated heavily in Quebec, where cheap, abundant hydroelectric power makes aluminum smelting economically viable, are feeding a huge share of the raw aluminum that ends up in American factories, American vehicles, American beverage cans, and American infrastructure. And now there's a new voracious buyer entering the picture, artificial intelligence. Data centers the massive server farms, powering the AI boom that Trump himself has repeatedly championed as a symbol of American technological dominance, require enormous quantities of aluminum. It's used in server racks, in cooling systems, in the physical infrastructure of these facilities that are being built at a blistering pace across the U.S. The irony practically writes itself. The very industry Trump wants to position as the crown jewel of American economic power is deeply, structurally dependent on the metal Canada ships south every single day. The U.S. ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, gave a revealing rundown earlier this year of what the Americans feel they genuinely need from Canada versus what they'd merely like to have. Potash made the need list. Cars landed in the nice-to-have, might-buy category. But aluminum? It didn't even get a mention in his framing, despite being arguably the single most irreplaceable input on the entire list. That omission tells you something important. The political conversation hasn't caught up to the economic reality. Here's the number that should be making U.S. manufacturers nervous. American smelters currently produce somewhere in the neighborhood of 660,000 tons of primary aluminum domestically. That sounds like a lot until you compare it to actual U.S. demand, which dwarfs that figure many times over. The gap between what America produces and what America consumes has to be filled from somewhere. And for decades, the answer has overwhelmingly been Canada. Trump's stated vision has been to reshore aluminum smelting, to bring that production back onto American soil, tariffs be damned, and let market forces and protectionist pressure rebuild a domestic industry. It's a compelling narrative for a political speech. It is, however, colliding hard with physical and economic reality. Aluminum smelting is one of the most electricity-intensive industrial processes on the planet. You don't stand up a new smelter in 18 months. You don't replicate Quebec's cheap hydroelectric advantage overnight, or at all in most U.S. states where power costs are simply higher. Building new smelting capacity is a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar undertaking, and even then, it doesn't guarantee cost parity with what Canada can produce. So, while the tariffs have absolutely hurt Canadian producers and Canadian officials have been open about the real fear of major damage to the industry, something else happened that changed the calculus. Aluminum prices themselves shot upward, partly as a consequence of the tariffs, and that price surge has actually cushioned Canadian producers from the worst of the blow. It's a strange kind of silver lining. The tariff war raised prices enough that Canadian exporters, even while paying the toll at the border, have avoided the catastrophic collapse many feared when the 50% rate was first announced. Meanwhile, American manufacturers who rely on aluminum as an input, everyone from beverage companies to automakers to aerospace suppliers, are the ones absorbing the cost. Tariffs are, after all, paid by the importer, not the exporter. That cost gets passed down the chain until it lands eventually on the American consumer, whether that's in the price of a car, a six-pack, or a new laptop housing. Trump has repeatedly argued that tariffs like these will force manufacturing to relocate back to the U.S., but independent economic data, so far, hasn't shown that shift materializing at anywhere near the scale needed to offset the reliance on Canadian aluminum. So where does this leave the actual negotiations? Because despite the fiery rhetoric on both sides, there is a negotiation happening, and it's worth understanding what's actually on the table. Canadian and American trade negotiators have been working through a revived proposal centered on tariff rate quotas, TRQs, in trade jargon for steel and aluminum. The basic idea is straightforward. Instead of a flat, punishing tariff on every ton that crosses the border, Canada would be allowed to export a certain volume of steel and aluminum at a lower or reduced tariff rate, with anything above that quota facing steeper charges. It's a compromise mechanism, a way to give Canadian producers predictable, discounted access to the U.S. market without the White House having to fully abandon its tariff posture. In exchange for that kind of relief, along with a broader rollback of the threatened 50% tariff on other goods, Canada has reportedly been willing to move on some of its own defensive measures, the provincial restrictions on American alcohol that several provinces imposed as retaliation, adjustments related to dairy import quotas, and potentially auto tariff concessions. Canada has also pushed for something bigger picture, a joint commitment to formally resume talks on updating the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, the trade pact that underpins the entire continental economic relationship, with those renewed negotiations targeted for the fall. But, and this is a big but, the U.S. side has a track record in these talks of moving the goalposts. After sending an initial letter laying out demands back in June, American trade officials reportedly followed up with an additional list of 10 more conditions, catching Canadian negotiators off guard. And there's a structural sticking point that's hard to paper over. Without the U.S. rolling back its auto tariffs on Canadian vehicles, it's considered highly unlikely that Ottawa would agree to remove its own counter tariffs. Neither side wants to be the one to blink first and hand the other a win without getting something concrete in return. All of this is happening against the backdrop of a hard deadline. Trump has threatened to impose that additional 50% tariff on a long list of Canadian goods by August 19th, just days from where this story currently stands. That date has become the pressure point around which the entire negotiation is orbiting. Canadian officials know it, American negotiators know it, and it's forcing both sides to decide, in a fairly compressed window, whether they're going to find enough common ground to avoid another dramatic escalation or whether this relationship is headed for its next major rupture. It's worth remembering this isn't the first time Canada and the U.S. have gone through a version of this exact fight. Back in 2020, during Trump's first term, Washington slapped new tariffs on Canadian aluminum, and Canada responded by preparing $3.6 billion in retaliatory tariffs of its own, deliberately targeting products manufactured in politically sensitive American swing states. It was a calculated move then, and it set the template for how Canada tends to respond to this kind of pressure now, not by folding, but by identifying exactly where it can apply reciprocal pain. If you want to understand why this fight is so lopsided in Canada's favor, you have to understand geography and physics, not just politics. Aluminum smelting is, at its core, an electricity business wearing a metal industry costume. Turning alumina into finished aluminum requires a staggering, near-constant flow of electricity running around the clock for years at a time. It's one of the most power-hungry industrial processes that exists. That single fact explains almost everything about why Quebec, of all places, became a global aluminum powerhouse. Quebec sits on some of the cheapest, most abundant hydroelectric power on the planet. Decades of investment in massive hydro dams gave the province an energy cost advantage that most American states simply cannot match, no matter how much political will gets thrown at the problem. You can subsidize a smelter. You can offer tax breaks. You can fast-track permits. What you can't easily do is manufacture a river system and 40 years of hydro infrastructure out of thin air. That's the barrier standing between Trump's stated goal of reshoring aluminum production and the actual physical reality of what it would take to pull that off. This is why industry watchers have been skeptical from the very first day these tariffs were announced that they'd trigger any meaningful wave of new American smelting capacity. A handful of announcements, sure, but announcements are cheap. Building, powering, and operating a fully functional aluminum smelter is a different order of magnitude entirely, and it's measured in years and billions of dollars, not press releases and campaign promises. So while the tariffs make headlines and the political theater plays out in Washington and Ottawa, the underlying supply chain barely moves. American manufacturers still need Canadian aluminum. Canadian smelters still have the cheapest power to make it. And that mismatch between political rhetoric and industrial reality is exactly the gap Canada has been trying to exploit at the negotiating table. It's easy to talk about tariffs in the abstract, so let's make this concrete for a second. Who actually feels this? Start with beverage makers. Aluminum cans are one of the most aluminum-intensive consumer products in daily use, and any sustained price increase in raw aluminum eventually shows up on grocery store shelves, whether that's a case of pop, sparkling water, or beer. Automakers are next in line. Modern vehicles use aluminum extensively in body panels, engine components, and increasingly in electric vehicle battery housings, where weight savings translate directly into range and efficiency. Then there's aerospace, a sector where the United States still holds a genuine global manufacturing advantage, and one that depends on a steady, high-quality supply of aluminum alloys that Canadian producers have spent decades perfecting relationships to deliver. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into a soundbite. Tariffs, framed as protecting American industry, can in the same breath quietly tax the very industries the administration is trying to champion. It's not a simple story of Canada versus America. It's a story of competing American priorities colliding with each other, and Canadian aluminum sitting right in the crossfire. Step back from the trade jargon for a second, because this isn't just a story about smelters and spreadsheets. It's a story that touches real communities. Quebec's aluminum industry supports tens of thousands of jobs, many of them in regions where the smelter is the economic anchor of the entire town. When tariffs threaten that industry, they threaten paychecks, local businesses, municipal tax bases, the whole ecosystem that builds up around a major employer. The fact that soaring prices have partially cushioned the blow doesn't mean workers and communities have been made whole. It means the worst-case scenario so far has been avoided, rather than the actual damage being erased. There's also a broader psychological shift happening across the country. Trump's repeated tariff threats, combined with his comments suggesting Canada should simply become part of the United States, have angered a wide swath of Canadians, not just policymakers in Ottawa, but ordinary people making everyday decisions. Cross-border travel has dropped noticeably, with many Canadians choosing to cancel American vacations and shopping trips in a kind of grassroots economic protest. Buy Canadian has moved from a slogan to an actual purchasing habit for a growing number of households, and new government procurement rules have started favoring domestic suppliers over American ones. This is a country recalibrating in real time how much it wants to depend on a neighbor whose leadership keeps threatening its sovereignty as a bargaining chip. So, what's the actual takeaway here? It's tempting to frame this as a simple story of Canadian defiance. Small country stands up to superpower, wins the day. And there's real truth in the idea that Canada has more leverage than the conventional narrative usually credits it with. The math is the math. America cannot simply will a domestic aluminum industry into existence at the scale it needs. Not in months, maybe not even in years, and certainly not without absorbing costs that get passed straight to American consumers and manufacturers in the meantime. But it would be an oversimplification to say Canada has won anything yet. This is still an active, unresolved negotiation with a looming deadline, a history of shifting demands from Washington, and deep structural disagreements, especially around autos, that neither side has found a way to bridge. Canadian officials are trying to extract real concessions, relief from the punishing tariffs, a path back to formal CUSMA renegotiation, and some predictability for industries that have been whipsawed by an unpredictable trade relationship for years now. Whether they get there by the time that August deadline hits, or whether this turns into another cycle of tariffs and retaliatory tariffs, is genuinely still an open question. What is clear is this: the old assumption that Canada simply has no choice but to accommodate whatever Washington demands doesn't hold up the way it used to. Aluminum, of all things unglamorous, indispensable, quietly powering everything from your kitchen foil to the AI servers, reshaping the global economy, has become one of the clearest illustrations of just how much leverage sits on the Canadian side of this relationship, even when American rhetoric suggests otherwise. This is a story that's still being written. The deadline is close, the negotiators are still at the table, still talking, going, and whatever happens next will say a lot about whether this trade relationship gets rebuilt on more balanced terms, or whether it's headed for its next collision. If you want to stay ahead of where this goes next, make sure you're subscribed, because this story is moving fast, and the outcome is going to shape prices, jobs, and the future of this trade relationship for years to come.